Hey guys, it's Kevin Ward again with Mix Coach. It's time for another episode of the Mix Coach Minute. And today, as promised, we have Stone Walters. So you may know Stone from some of the articles that he writes for Mix Coach. Stone is a friend of mine, and he asks such great questions that I just love to sit and talk to Stone about some of the questions he has. So, Stone has another question today, and I'd like to just toss it to you, Stone.
Cool. Well, Kevin, thanks again for having me. This question is about when you're mixing multi-mics drums, or maybe just drums in general. What's your whole take on drummer's perspective versus audience perspective?
Okay. Well, I have an interesting perspective on this because my perspective is actually both.
Hmm.
And you may be wondering why that is because my first big studio job was at a studio where it was a little bit like the Motown Nashville A Team sort of Muscle Shoals sound in the fact that there was a team of people creating the music.
Right.
I was the engineer. We had a drummer, a bass player, a guitar player, a steel player who played everything else, and then a piano player. And it was the same team almost every time. Well, the drummer was left-handed,
Oh wow.
so my drummer's perspective was his audience perspective.
Oh.
So it was really not it was really not a problem for me at all because and also I play the drums a little bit too, so I like to hear the high tom to happen where the high tom would happen for me. So
Right.
in my opinion, it should almost always be drummer's perspective because I'm a drummer, but to solidify that, the drummer I recorded all the time was a lefty. So his name is Tony Kreisman. He's an incredible drummer, and I learned a lot about miking drums and getting balances, which I think we're going to talk about tomorrow on the Mix Coach Minute. But yeah, in my opinion, the drums should feel like the drums are happening about where they do in the if you're sitting behind a kit. So there was a time, and I still do occasionally when I'm looking for a lot of width in a mix. I will mix the high tom hard left and the low tom hard right. But
Okay.
these days, what I do now is I'll listen. Sometimes I'll listen to the overhead, but most of the time I'm familiar with the drummer that I'm mixing, and I remember how the kit is set up. And
Right.
usually the high tom is about 11 o'clock. The mid
Mhm.
tom is about 2 o'clock. And the low tom is hard right.
Right.
That's usually how I mix the toms. But if you really want to get all ninja on it, and listen to the overheads. And if there's enough imaging on the overheads, try to match the imaging of where the tom happened in the overheads to the tom in the panning
Right.
and then, of course, as I've talked about in many episodes, and when I talk about on Mixed Coach Member all the time, is that listen to it mono and make sure that your tom is in phase with your overheads. Otherwise, if you get that panning just right and your tom is exactly where it is in the stereo field, then it's pretty much going to be mono when you
Okay.
mix it, unless it's in phase with the overhead mic. So, and there's hardly any chance at all that the toms will be out of phase relative to the overhead mics with each other. So,
Right. Right.
the only chance you have of getting the phase wrong on the toms is if somehow electrically or electronically the phase is out on the tom. So, as far as drummer's perspective versus audience perspective, for me, it's drummer's perspective. And again, to solidify that, it was because I had a left-handed drummer that I learned to mic drums and mix drums with. So I know that may not be the answer you were looking for, but
And
did you
this
have
brings,
any? Did you?
maybe.
I'm sorry. Did you have another follow-up question for that?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I was going to say you mentioned something about the imaging of the overheads. Um, when you're talking about matching the drums, which kind of makes me think when you say you've recorded the drums or you're listening to the drums and you're listening to the imaging, do you keep the overheads panned hard left and right, or do you, if you're aware of how it was recorded in the session, do you bring it in so that it is similar to as if you were the drummer sitting by the drums? Because I guess the drums wouldn't wrap around the drummer in
Yeah,
real life.
that's another. This is why I love talking to you, Stone, because that's a great question. I always pan the overheads hard left and right, unless there's
Right.
some odd something going on in the track, like maybe there's a buildup on one side, or possibly the overheads weren't recorded that well.
Right.
And the only
It's an imbalance.
the only instance that I don't pan the overheads hard left or right is if there is some kind of phase discrepancy in the overheads. In
Right.
other
Okay.
words, I can't flip the phase of one side to correct it in mono. I can't slip one side in or out to make it phase line up. And
Mm-hmm.
what happens is I try to equalize what it sounds like in stereo versus mono. And I find that if I don't go hard left and right, then when I go mono, it's not as drastic of a difference. So
Right.
if I do have a phase problem in the overheads, I will pull it into about 10 and 2 or 9 and 3, just
Okay.
so that when I mono it, it only goes that far, that much difference instead of hard left and hard right to mono. So it's
Brilliant.
not completely canceled out. You're kind of almost hearing some of the cancellation, and then if it's really really bad, I might take the overheads and almost mono them,
Right. Okay.
um, or pick one side, whichever one, you know, because a lot of times you can't really tell how they recorded it. It's just
Hmm.
that the phase is not right in my headphones or my ears or my monitors.
So if you were to describe then the shape of the drums in your mix, how would you describe it as a shape from left to right, front to back? So, for example, because you just said if ever you had to take the overheads, just one mic, and when you said that, I almost saw like a triangular type sound, and I saw like with the peak of the triangle, the apex of the triangle further back in the mix. If you've got everything panned hard right and hard left, what shape does the drums create? And the reason I ask that is because then when I guess you're adding guitars and you're adding other things, does that create any masking problems, or does that give them a nice context within which to exist in the
Hmm.
mix as well?
You know what? I have never thought about the shape of drums
Mm.
as it pertains to how in the imaging in the mix. I think that maybe I don't think on that plane of mixing, and or it could be that it could be that some people overthink the
Mm.
drums, because I also had another mentor who told me if it sounds good, it is good.
Good.
So I
Yeah.
kind of go I kind of go with
Right.
that
Yeah.
rule most of the
Yeah.
time. So I've never really thought about the shape of drums. I guess if I had to put a shape on it, it would be real triangular. Uh, I guess with you know the snare and the kick always hitting in the middle.
Mm.
That's one other instance where I may pan the overheads a little bit, is if the overheads somehow picked up the snare and the snare is just a little to the left, I will
Right.
compensate for that to make the snare in the middle. So if the snare is in the middle and the toms or in the if the kick and the snare are in the middle and the overheads are hard left and right, I guess that would be, if it was a shape, it would be triangular, right?
Right. Yeah. That's what I
So
would say anyway.
yeah, yeah,
The reason I ask is because I tend to see things more visually. Once I can see it, then it makes sense to me. So
yeah.
I'm kind of trying to figure out spatially where the sounds are happening.
I'm a visual person too, and I learn by watching. But I have never thought about. I probably will now. I've got another mix to do this afternoon, and I probably will start thinking shapes now, just so I can tell you next time exactly what shape the drums are in.
I see squares. I see squares.
That's a great question, Stone. And Stone, we may be back for one more question tomorrow from Stone in this series. But thank you again, Stone. I think Stone would agree with me that Mix Coach Member is the best place to learn to mix. We have a different
Absolutely.
session every month. We have guys just like Stone all over the forum answering questions, giving feedback to their brothers in arms. And then we do a different song every month. There's tutorials for those songs, and we would love to have you as a Mix Coach member. So check out mixcoachmember.com when you get a chance, and we'll see you tomorrow.